I still remember the day I realized my stepfather had pinned a crime on me that I never committed. I had just turned 17 at the time, living in the outskirts of Chicago with my mother and him, my so-called guardian. My father had died when I was 10, and for a long time, it was just me and my mom trying to make ends meet. Then came this tall, broad-shouldered stranger with a bit of charm and a lot of promises. He was good at talking his way into her heart, and soon enough, he moved in. Back then, I believed in second chances and in the possibility that a man could love someone else's child as his own. But as the months wore on, I saw the cracks beneath his smooth exterior. There were late nights where I could smell alcohol seeping through the walls of my tiny bedroom, and mornings where he'd greet me with a glance that spoke volumes of how little he actually thought of me. I tried to ignore the tension, for my mother's sake. She looked so happy whenever he showered her with attention, and I didn't want to be the reason that rare smile faltered. So I kept my mouth shut, even when he said things that made me feel worthless, even when I heard hushed arguments about money in the kitchen. I wanted to believe in the illusion that my mom had finally found someone who cared for both of us. But illusions have a way of shattering. One evening, I woke up to hushed voices arguing just outside my bedroom door. My mother's frantic whisper carried through the thin walls, and I caught snippets of words like mortgage and emergency fund. My heart pounded because I knew she had a bit of money set aside for a rainy day, a small sum she had painstakingly saved from her nursing shifts at the local hospital. I didn't know the full extent of her finances, but I was aware that it was all she had for our immediate security. I tried to fall back asleep, telling myself that everything would be fine by morning, but my restless mind wouldn't let me. When the sun finally rose, my stepfather was already gone. My mother sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee, as though it might hold the answers to her silent pleas. She looked up when she noticed me, the worry lines etched into her face deepening. She didn't say much, only that she needed to speak with him again before we decided on any course of action. I offered to help in any way I could, but she insisted everything was under control. Even then, I sensed a storm brewing, one that would soon tear apart our fragile life. Yet, I never imagined just how vicious that storm would become, nor that it would leave me standing alone with the wreckage. No, I had no idea that my stepfather's darkness was about to swallow me whole. About a week later, my stepfather returned in the dead of night. I was awakened by the sound of the front door slamming, and I heard him stumbling in the hallway. He reeked of sweat and stale cigarette smoke. My mother rushed to him, begging to know where he had been and what had happened to the money they'd been discussing. I stayed in the shadows, watching him sway as he tried to piece together a believable lie. First, he mumbled something about an investment that had gone wrong. Then, with more urgency, he wove a story about how he was robbed at gunpoint outside a bar. I could see in my mother's eyes that she wanted to believe him, but the logic didn't line up. If he was robbed, why didn't he file a police report? Where had he really been? Eventually, his frustration boiled over and he turned his anger onto me. He pointed an accusing finger in my direction, slurring his words as he shouted that he knew I'd stolen the money, that I must have snuck into the bedroom safe. The accusation felt like a punch to the gut. I was 17, with no means to even access the safe, let alone knowledge of its combination. And yet, he insisted I was the culprit. My mother looked torn, caught between her love for me and her desire to trust the man she'd let into our home. I will never forget the moment when she asked me, with tears in her eyes, if I had taken the money. I denied it with every ounce of sincerity I had. I expected my mother to defend me, to see through the lies. She knew me better than anyone, or so I believed. But my stepfather's hold on her was stronger than I realized. He had planted seeds of doubt, feeding on every little mistake or teenage rebellion I'd had. Suddenly, I was the rebellious kid who talked back in class once or stayed out late with friends without permission. Those trivial missteps became evidence of my deceitful nature. Each time I insisted on my innocence, he twisted my words, making it appear as though I was only trying to cover my tracks. Eventually, I saw the uncertainty in my mother's eyes solidify into suspicion. I was crushed. The day after that confrontation, I found my clothes packed into 2 suitcases left by the door. My mother stood by silently as my stepfather instructed me to get out, telling me I was no longer welcome under their roof. He spat at my feet, calling me a thief, a lowlife who'd stolen from my own family. I pleaded with my mother, reminded her of our bond, of all the times we stood by each other when Dad died. But she just stared at the floor, her shoulders trembling in silent guilt or fear. That was the moment I realized I had lost her to him. I grabbed my bags and left, vowing that one day I would have my reckoning. I spent my first night away from home on a park bench. It was a warm summer evening, at least, but the humiliation seared deeper than any cold could have. I had a few $100s saved from my part-time job at a grocery store, but it wouldn't last long. My immediate concern was survival, and the only place I could think to go was an old friend's garage. Her parents were reluctant to let me stay at first, but they agreed to let me crash there for a couple of nights after hearing my story. I never mentioned the details of the theft accusation. I just said there was trouble at home, which wasn't far from the truth. Over the next few weeks, I learned the harsh reality of being on my own. I applied to every restaurant, retail shop, and gas station I could find. I cut back on meals, sometimes going to bed with an empty stomach just to stretch my limited funds. Pride wasn't a luxury I could afford anymore, so I took whatever odd jobs came my way. Whether it was mowing lawns or washing dishes at a dive bar, I did it. All the while, bitterness grew inside me like a festering wound. The memories of my stepfather's accusations, the pain on my mother's face as she watched me leave, haunted my every waking moment. I was determined to prove myself, to succeed, if only to show them they had made a grave mistake. After turning 18, I managed to secure a spot in a community college. Tuition was a concern, but financial aid and scholarships became my lifeline. I studied business administration, not out of any deep passion, but because I saw it as a tool. I wanted the skills to climb society's ladder, to gain influence and power, anything that would help me eventually stand toe-to-toe with my stepfather. The nights were long. I worked at a nearby convenience store until midnight, then stayed up late finishing assignments. My social life was non-existent, but I didn't care. The only relationships I fostered were alliances with professors who could vouch for my determination and classmates who I could team up with for study groups. I spent weekends volunteering at local nonprofits, partly to pad my resume, and partly to remind myself that despite everything, I still had some kindness left in me. Yet, beneath that veneer of diligence, an unquenchable thirst for vengeance simmered. I'd find myself daydreaming about confronting my stepfather, shoving cold, hard evidence of my success in his face. I imagined my mother standing beside him, finally recognizing her mistake and begging for my forgiveness. Those fantasies fueled me, but they also kept me up at night, filling me with a restless energy. I was on a mission, and nothing would deter me. Some people might call it toxic or obsessive, but I saw it as my only solace. I was forging a new path, and every step I took was aimed at returning to the place I was exiled from, stronger and less merciful than before. 4 years passed in a blur of lectures, late-night shifts, and relentless ambition. I graduated with honors, clutching my diploma as though it were a ticket to a life I'd been denied. After that, I managed to land an entry-level job at a small financial consulting firm. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was enough for me to finally rent a modest apartment and start building a semblance of stability. I poured myself into my work, determined to climb the corporate ladder faster than anyone else. I studied the markets, read every business journal I could find, and volunteered for the most challenging projects. My boss took notice, and within 2 years, I was promoted. My colleagues whispered about my single-mindedness, the way I never joined them for happy hour or team dinners. There were rumors that I had no personal life, no family to speak of. Let them think what they wanted. My personal life was overshadowed by a single purpose. I saved every spare dollar, investing carefully, quietly growing my portfolio. Sometimes I'd sit in my apartment at night, staring at my reflection in the window, and wonder if my mother ever regretted what she had allowed to happen. I heard from distant relatives that she and my stepfather were still together, living in the old house, barely scraping by. Rumor had it he gambled heavily, losing more than he won, but always managing to spin a yarn that it would pay off soon. With each rumor, my resolve to destroy him grew stronger. A turning point came when I met an older businessman named Victor at a conference in New York. He was everything I aspired to be, successful, respected, and intimidating in the boardroom. We struck up a conversation after I asked a particularly pointed question during his panel discussion. Perhaps he saw a bit of himself in my hunger, Or maybe he just liked the attention I gave him. Either way, he offered me a job at his private equity firm, a position that promised more challenges and far greater rewards. I jumped at the chance. Working under Victor was like being thrown into the deep end of a shark tank. He expected results, and he had no patience for excuses. I thrived under the pressure, devouring knowledge on mergers, acquisitions, and leveraging assets. I also learned about strategic takedowns, how to dismantle a competitor by targeting their weaknesses and exploiting their debts. Victor taught me that sometimes business isn't just about profit. It's about power and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you've bested your rival. As the months rolled by, I began to see a path. My stepfather's gambling addiction was a glaring vulnerability, a crack in his defenses. If he owed money to the wrong people, if he was desperate enough, I could maneuver him into a financial trap. With Victor's guidance, I learned the art of the deal, and more importantly, the art of retribution. I studied my stepfather's patterns from a distance, gathering information from mutual acquaintances and public records. Soon, an opportunity presented itself, and I knew it was time to strike. I learned through a contact that my stepfather had been borrowing money from various loan sharks. He was on the hook for a significant sum, and his attempts at winning big in the casino were only sinking him further. I approached one of these creditors through a shell company I set up, offering to buy my stepfather's debt at a slight premium. The deal was simple enough for the creditor. He'd recover most of his money without having to chase my stepfather down. And for me, it meant I now owned my stepfather's obligation. Legally, he owed me, though he had no idea. The next step was to tighten the noose. I orchestrated a situation where he would be lured into a new gambling opportunity, an underground casino that one of Victor's associates controlled. With the false promise of a hot tip, my stepfather was enticed to go all in on a rigged, high-stakes poker game, double or nothing. Predictably, he lost everything. In that moment, he was hopelessly trapped, owing more money than he could ever repay. That's when I revealed myself. I showed up at his doorstep, a polite smile on my face, a thick folder of legal documents in hand. He looked older, weaker than I remembered, with a stained undershirt and trembling hands. I introduced myself as the representative of the company that now owned his debts. When he realized who I was, his face went pale. It was as if he'd seen a ghost returning for vengeance. I made him an offer. He could sign over the title to the house, along with any other assets he possessed, and I would consider his debt partially settled. He'd still owe a large sum, of course, but the immediate threat of legal action would be postponed. I watched him wrestle with the decision, fear warring with pride in his eyes. The man who once called me a thief now stood on the brink of losing everything, forced to beg for mercy. My mother appeared in the doorway, her gaze darting between us. She looked frail, as though life had ground her down since I left. She didn't recognize me at first. Maybe she never truly saw me, even when I was a child. But when she realized who I was, she let out a choked sob. I told her I wasn't here for reconciliation or pity. I was here on business, pure and simple. My stepfather tried to protest, to come up with some scheme to buy time. He claimed he'd find a way to repay the debt if I just gave him a chance. I laughed bitterly. The same man who had robbed my mother, who had lied and turned her against me, was now pleading for compassion. Did he truly believe I had any left for him? I laid out the documents on the dusty coffee table and insisted he sign. Watching the pen tremble in his hand as he scribbled his name felt like poetic justice. In the weeks that followed, I seized every asset he had. The house was sold at auction, with the proceeds funneled into my company. The vehicles he owned were repossessed. Any semblance of financial security he once had vanished, leaving him to fend for himself on the streets, just as I had to do years ago. My mother tried to call me, leaving tearful voicemails asking me to spare him. She claimed he'd changed, that he was remorseful. Each time, I deleted the messages without listening to the end. It wasn't that I found joy in her suffering. It was simply that I had no pity left for a man who had shown me none. Word spread through the neighborhood about what had happened, and some people branded me as heartless. But they hadn't lived through the betrayal, the humiliation, the nights on a park bench. I'd crafted this fate for him, yes, but I saw it as retribution, not cruelty. Meanwhile, in the business world, my star continued to rise. With the capital gain from the sale of his property, I reinvested, striking deals that multiplied my earnings. Victor was impressed by my tenacity, though he never pried into how I came into possession of those particular assets. In his world, results mattered more than explanations. I relished the success, yet I felt an odd emptiness gnawing at me. I dedicated so much of my life to this revenge, and now that it was done, I found myself asking what came next. I began to wonder if I'd become as heartless as the man I despised. Late at night, in the quiet of my penthouse, doubts surfaced about what my revenge had cost me. Then, I received a letter from my mother saying my stepfather had died in an alley behind the old casino. She asked me to attend his funeral. Though I felt no pity, something compelled me to go. I arrived at a small cemetery where my mother stood alone by a cheap coffin. She looked up, tears freezing on her cheeks. We didn't speak. I stayed until the coffin was lowered, then turned to leave. She grabbed my arm, whispered an apology, but I said nothing. There was no forgiveness left in me, only the hollow realization that I had become a stranger to her. In that moment, I understood the final price of my vengeance. Though I had claimed justice, I had lost the last remnants of the love I once cherished. As I walked away, I felt an echo of my younger self, still longing for a mother's embrace. Yet I knew that door had closed forever, leaving emptiness in its wake.